Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Beyond Launch, Nurturing and Maintaining Design Systems. Um, we are so excited to see so many of y'all joining us from around the world. I'm Jocelyn, Head of Community at Supernova. And Supernova, if you don't know, is an end-to-end design system platform where you can connect all your data sources, create customized documentation, and also automate code delivery. So a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into our panel today. It is recorded, so if you have another meeting or something comes up, no worries. We will send you the recording via email later this week. You can also enable automated captions if you like, and you're also free to chat with other participants in the chat and share where you're located and what you do. But if you have any questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function or else we might miss it in the chat. And we'll definitely be saving some time at the end for audience questions. And if there are more questions that we don't get to, our panelists have kindly agreed to also answer them via blog post if there are that many. So today we are joined by an incredible lineup of design system experts to talk about all things design systems maintenance. So we'll be chatting about what maintaining a design system entails and who should do it, how to balance growth and innovation with scale and maintenance, and when you should deprecate or version a part of your design system. But let's first get started with a round of introductions so we all know who's talking. Panelists, can you share a little bit more about yourself, including your name, your preferred pronouns, where you currently work, and how long you've been working in design systems? Let's start with Bethany.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Hey, y'all. Excited to be here with you today. My name is Bethany Sonefeld. I am coming to you based from Austin, Texas right now. We just broke our streak of 45-degree days that were over 100 degrees. So I'm very much looking forward to fall. My pronouns are she, her, and I am currently working at Cisco Secure, working in their cybersecurity division. I'm the design manager for the Duo Authentication Group. So if you've ever used the Duo mobile app, that is my team. They're awesome. And I have worked with design systems directly for 2.5 years spent working on a design system, and then kind of adjacent to that, about 6 to 7 years in total. So excited to share what I've learned and to learn from all of y'all as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Henry Daggett. I am tuning in from London in England today. I want to say that we've probably just broken our streak of sort of getting above 20 degrees, which is, what is that, like 60 degrees Fahrenheit? We've had a horrible summer here. So a little bit cold. My pronouns are he, him. And yeah, so I'm the design systems lead at Societe Generale. I've been working at Societe Generale and in design systems for about 5 years now. And going sort of way back beyond that, my background's actually in architecture, which is what I studied and started off in. And I can tell you there are lots of little design system links that come from the architectural world there. So yeah, and then just a little fun fact about me is that I'm sort of slightly obsessed with working with developers at the moment. That's really my key point of view. I'm really looking to see how we can sort of help build and create there. So that's going to be a lot of my angle.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy Dizon. I am a lead product designer at Disney Streaming. My pronouns are he, him. I'm based in the Bay Area, which is in Northern California. So I saw some people mention in the chat, Bay Area. I looked back at how long I've been doing this, and officially it's 7 years, which is kind of crazy. But just like what Bethany said, I've kind of been doing it years before that, kind of touching little things here and there, especially as a production designer, at the beginning of my design career. But like Henry, I love this handoff conversation between design and engineering, and really excited to talk to everybody about how we do that, as well as how y'all do it. Because what I love about systems is that we learn from each other. So
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Cool. So to get things started, would love to just start with some basic definition. Design system is also called design language system. So I want to make sure we're all speaking that same language. So first things first, what does maintaining a design system mean to you all? What does that entail? Henry, if you could kick us off, that'd be great. Because I remember reading one of your articles about how you call it the maintenance mode.
Yeah. So maintenance mode is definitely. I think to start off, I suppose it's a mindset shift. I think when you're at the beginning of your design system journey, it's very much sort of like creating, and there's a fair amount of excitement there. I think it's probably some of the most rewarding design systems work, and I can definitely understand why there are so many consultants who just focus on that period. And then you kind of shift into maintenance where things slow down. You have to make sure that everything actually works, and a surprising amount of stuff doesn't work. I think it can up for just about everything that we make. And then for the rest of maintenance, it really is just, I think, a really core focus on providing value. Obviously, there's a ton of upfront value that you get from just having design systems, just having that reusability. But it's then making sure that you can continue that value and make sure that more people can get that value. And then also just staying alive. Like, I think a frightening amount of design systems fail here and there. So a lot of maintenance mode is making sure that you don't do that, after your original launch. So if I have to sum it up, that's going to be there.
Bethany and Jeremy, anything else y'all want to add?
Yeah, I like Henry's approach to like kind of entering into a new phase or a new season of maintaining. That's really what it's about. And when I think about like the design systems that have been successful, I think that they've set up processes really well to help that maintenance mode. So it's just a lot of admin style stuff sometimes, like, intake forms. How are you communicating with your product teams, comms channels, newsletters, office hours? Those things I think really help your design system thrive when you're in maintenance mode. And I think if you can set those up early, to have this kind of dynamic, living, breathing documentation, contribution process is another big one. It can just really set you up for success so that maintenance mode can feel still creative and fun.
Henry and Bethany mentioned all the great tenets of maintenance mode and this idea that our work's not done. But what's the cool aspect is that, when a system is built, you have consultants and people that you trust to kind of like, hey, is this working? Now we become the street team of like, hey, does this work for you? Can we add some things? We're the ones we're stewards of this thing. And so now it's like in practice, how do we make this thing better? But we can't just glean that from seeing how everyone uses it. And everyone's different, right? The representation in the tools and how people think about, their day to day. And so that's the new fun part of like, okay, we built this thing, and now like, how do we refine it for actually in practice? And that's when we get to talk to each other and see how you use it and break it. And I know I've worked on many systems, and after we launched, like, wow, if we knew what we knew now, we would do things differently. And that's the cool conversation to have. And so, yeah, like I have a perspective on that, but we can dive into that later.
Yeah, so you mentioned like, what does maintenance look like in practice? What does that day-to-day look like? I would love to hear, like, as maintainers or when you're in maintenance mode, what does that look like day-to-day, to give folks a taste of what that's like if they haven't quite launched yet?
I think Bethany said it, which is like often it's a lot of admin, and I don't think if people sort of realize that so much. But I think I often start my days off like literally trawling through tickets. Like we really try to narrow down our different gateways to give feedback. So now we manage everything on GitHub, so it's a GitHub issue, and we have two major sources, like one for developers and one for designers. And so I'm in all of those, mainly the developer one actually, because that's where we get most of the activity from people actually using the system directly. So I'd say there's a lot of sort of like answering that. There's also a lot of Q&A. So that, I think that was one of the parts that surprised me a lot, is how much Q&A got scaled up. Which, I mean, I suppose it makes sense. People just want to know, like, oh, why isn't this working, or how does this work? And then the rest of it is, so at least from my part, so the way that we work, what I do is a lot of sort of like work organization. So it's working with people who can help me, or working with people who can help the system, and trying to organize contributors and things like that. and then a healthy amount of design and design review work, which is what I really enjoy at the moment. So lots of that.
And going off what Henry mentioned, like a lot of things when we built is kind of a snapshot of the world. And so there may be things that we think in documentation, for example, like, oh, this will explain everything. And you have these great questions from engineers and designers and PMs. You're like, oh yeah, how does it actually work? Or what's the answer here? Whether it's a pattern that we have thought of and we can't it's surfaced somewhere else, then we didn't think about it. And so those are the things that, like, you know, I know I focus on documentation a lot because that scales the small design systems team, and we're trying to teach everyone to find the answer for themselves and empower themselves to, like, okay, now I know what this thing's about, and be that expert now, for that component, for that pattern, for whatever. But if it's not there, you know, that's on us. And bringing these things up to us, whether it's Slack message or you know, a Jira ticket bug, it's super helpful to continue evolving the system and making it more robust. And so, again, we have a perspective when we build these things, and then when we open it up to everybody, we learn a lot about how people use things and what they care about. And so that's the fun part. But you know, getting those channels set up is really important, and things that we didn't consider. We're not admins and we're not writers. We're designers like everybody else, but we flex those muscles because we need to, because we know the system is more valuable when everyone has a hand in it.
Yeah, I heard two things from both Henry and Jeremy, and one was just being in this kind of like curiosity mode, like intaking what you're hearing from your teams, learning, being curious about how they're using the system and applying it. So that's one thing that comes to mind when I think about day to day. But then the other part that I heard both of you speak about is really the strategy kind of comes in here. Like, okay, we're hearing a lot of this, we're gathering feedback. How do we apply it for either the next version, or, you know, what does this look like going forward? How do we tailor this feedback? Because it can feel like at first you're kind of drinking from a fire hose, right? Like, it's exciting, but it's also like, oh my goodness, we're hearing so much from our teams. So there's strategy that's involved there in terms of, you know, how do we apply this feedback for our team going forward?
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And switching gears a little bit, who maintains your design systems? I know not everybody has a dedicated design systems team. Sometimes it's a council, sometimes it's like everybody's all working on it. Are there dedicated people on your all's team who are dedicated maintainers and who focus on specific aspects of that?
I'd love to hear Jeremy's perspective, being in an org as big as Disney, like how things are structured over there.
I was thinking about this. I'm lucky enough I've worked at many companies, and you know, obviously every company is different and org structure is different, but kind of the places I've worked at, especially here at Disney, there's actually a very small crew. And we're figuring things out also, whether it makes sense to stay platform specific, right? So we have web, living room, and mobile. And so do we have our systems maintainers focused on those libraries versus, you know, we have multiple brands. So how do we reconcile that? At Lyft, it was brand agnostic, or not brand, platform agnostic. And so you would support, I know I was supporting every platform. Well, it was only web and mobile, but you would kind of bring those patterns up to light. And sometimes it got really confusing because, like, oh, I'm my traditional web designer, who do I go to? Who do I talk to? And so we set up at Lyft, we set up a office hours where we had signups. So if you're specifically talking about design and web, then we would make sure the right people are in the room, especially our engineers as well. And so a lot of I've been lucky enough that I've been on teams that were specifically design systems, and even found ways to poach people because they really are systems thinkers. And, you know, this is a great way to kind of, you know, propel your career, because you're not just thinking about a feature, you're thinking about all the features and then all platforms and all the brands if you're multi-brand. And that's sometimes scary and sometimes a lot of fun and stuff that I know we probably all three kind of stay up at night thinking about. But I personally think a team is minimum to maintain a system because there's so many different facets of it. You know, I think about the you mentioned about contribution. That's a whole new ball game, you know, and like all these other admin processes, like you can focus on bugs and fixing those. There's also like, you know, all the great things that people are creating, but they might be very similar to someone other team that's creating the same thing. And like we don't want these bespoke solutions out there. And I think Henry mentioned about like design reviews, like that's when we can come together and help kind of hone it, but to ensure that it supports everybody. And so it's a lot of different hats we wear, but within the maintenance, I think that falls into maintenance because we're focused on it. And we have to kind of like support where we need to support. And every team is different. Every feature team is at a different, you know, pace. And so whether they need consulting or they need a bug fix or they need a new variant, that kind of falls into our realm. And having a non-dedicated team or individuals, it's very hard to do, even though there may be some motivation around it. So first, I think I would love a larger team, but I've seen teams of like 2 or 3, and I think they move mountains. They do miracle work. So.
We are also a big org with a small team as well, I'd say. We are basically completely federated, if I want to use that word. So we set up a design system council, and I think Jeremy said early on, sort of stewards, and yeah, it's really the role of stewards, the people who are in the council. So we heavily rely on contributions from our design team and from developers as well. And when it comes to that, we really look for people who are experts in what we're trying to do. So for example, a while back, we worked on data visualization colors, and we just happened to have one of our designers in the team was basically a data visualization expert. So why would we go and learn all of that ourselves when we've got someone? So we roped them in. I hope willingly. They were quite willing. But yeah, so that's kind of the way that we operate. So we rely on people who have the skill sets already. I will say though, that when it comes to development, we do basically have 1 or 2 dedicated developers. And I think without that dedicated dev time, there would definitely be big blockers there, because design can move quite fast on its own. Like you can design something and get it to like QA stage in a couple of weeks, but without that development, then you're not really releasing anything into the actual wild to really test. But yeah, so in the council, we have sort of quite strict guidelines on our council. We have 4 people, and we try and be representative from sort of around the org. And I think at the moment we've got 3 designers and 1 developer. One of those designers is me, sort of acting as the lead. And we use the council as like a decision-making council. We have, you know, like weekly meetings and things like that. And we sort of really steward the design system and push forward. And I'd say, like, me personally, I still occasionally work on other projects like around the company. And it's really much like a rotation. Like every now and again you might rotate on and off the council. So that's the way that we're operating things, and it's been going strong for like 2 or 3 years now in the council, and we've rotated quite a few people on and off. So yeah, we're really happy with that setup for the time being. But I think something to note is that be flexible with your setups, you know? Like I think a lot of people get really stuck saying like, we will have a core team and they will smash out a design system. But I think it's okay if that's not working for you, like just pivot and try another setup. There are lots of them out there. Lots of them have been documented as well, so.
Yeah, I feel like every org looks different. So there's no kind of one size fits all of what a design systems team should look like. I think, you know, teams are named something different. So for example, at Cisco, we have a design enablement team. And then within that, there's a smaller subset of folks that are focused on building out our design system. But like Henry said, it's really about being flexible. And even as your org grows or continues to scale, you're going to run into some speed bumps. So figuring out if you're able to have a dedicated team, I think that's amazing and that's great. It really helps your design system get legs. But if you're not able to do that, or you don't have the resourcing, like find what works for you and your team, whether it's, 60-40, you're kind of splitting your time. But yeah, it's really interesting to me. I love hearing how different design systems teams are structured, because it really is different depending on the sector, the domain space you're in and size of the org and everything like that.
Yeah, totally. I hear what y'all are saying about being flexible, because design systems really are a product, like living, breathing organisms, basically. So it makes sense that the folks working on them also kind of adapt to what's needed for the design system at that time. And also just like what resourcing is available at the company, or like who you can poach or who has expertise in certain things. So moving on to a slightly different topic, how do you all balance and prioritize building new things, whether that's new components, design tokens, patterns, or even writing up new documentation or updating what you have, with maintaining and updating what already exists? What's that look like? Is it 100% maintenance mode, nothing new is being created, or is it more 60-40, 50-50? Where are you all at?
I can jump in. I think we've got quite a rigorous framework for this sort of thing. So I'll talk about new components and new stuff first. So like I said earlier, we gather all requests via GitHub and those channels, so everything's like already in an issue. Then we discuss them in the council, and that's where prioritization starts happening. We basically have a rule where it's like, if 3 different projects want the same thing, then we're pretty likely to do it, unless it's something crazy, but then also there are some variable factors there. So let's say if one of our really important services needs something, then we might drop everything and work on that for them. It has happened a few times, actually. And so for new stuff, that's really how we prioritize. For bug fixes and things like that, all sorts of fixes, it really depends on the size and severity. I think that's quite easy to see severity, though. You can see how much it's impacting usually. So we just prioritize that by severity and how quick it's going to be. But usually we will prioritize bugs, especially any breaking bugs, above any kind of feature release. So that's the priority there. Then when it comes to documentation and when it comes to other things like that, often we'll have sort of specific periods where we work on one thing. So right now, for example, we've just released like a new version of our design system, and we're working really, really hard on documenting it and making sure that documentation's out there directly. And then for some of the smaller things, like if you want to make a guide, or like sometimes just basic documentation isn't enough, then that's more ad hoc, and so someone might just jump in and pick that up. And we also, like in our chats, whatever, we open it up to other people. So often I'll message like the whole design team and be like, does anyone want to work on this? And then they might. So that's sort of our prioritization method. I'd say the three requirement rule is really useful.
And jump in a little bit, I guess. We're at an interesting time at Disney streaming, where we have 2 systems, Disney Plus and Hulu, and they're robust systems and they have all the different things. And so now are the systems teams, we're looking at, is there a way to bridge that gap, knowing there's different componentry and patterns and states and et cetera. And it's a really interesting problem to kind of like think through. And so we are trying to figure out that whole conversation, like what's our maintenance focus time versus anything new. And anything new, we understand that like the code bases are still different, and whether we design a kind of a component that goes across, it's still going to be slightly different, right? Whether it's brand expression or all those nuances. And so how do we tackle that? And so if anyone has any ideas, let us know, because we're still trying to research this and find the best way, because being in systems for so long, it's like you start going down a route and you're like, makes sense now, and then something else comes up and you learn something and I'm like, whoa, that's blows this whole thing out of the water. Can we incorporate that? And so that's where we're at right now, just trying to figure out what works best, especially with such a large team, such diverse kind of, goals in mind for the range of partners that we work with, from very small features to across similar features, like, a details page exists across on Hulu and Disney Plus. Like, how close should they be? And so all those great things that Henry mentioned, something we want to strive to get to. The three team like need is at Lyft. At other places I worked at, also it was two. We were very like, oh, if two teams need it, then we're going to bring it into the system, and there are some times when, we work with our growth team very closely here. It's like, well, they're building some great new things. Like, well, we're trying to get to a point where we can have that conversation about, this is a great these new things you're creating is great. Can this be used on other things? Do we envision it being valuable for other teams, maybe in a different iteration of it, or if we add something to it? Because, I think we all know that as system stewards, we can only go so far because we're not as close to our users as those teams are. And so we need to leverage them as best we can. And so a lot of in design, it's up and down, right? Like, maybe it's a week full of like, oh, we just need to maintain this thing. Like, we need to up level that documentation, or, Figma drops something new, which is a great conversation to have. And do we need to incorporate these things now? Like, if it's in beta, how much effort do we want to put into it now, right? That might be an overhaul of, and really a lot of maintenance time, versus something new that someone's creating, that we can consult on and have them kind of run with, and then keep them within the playground of the sandbox that we all work in.
Yeah, I love that sentiment, Jeremy, around like really trying to find that balance and also trying to align it with what you're hearing from your product teams. Like, do they have an upcoming release that they need a component for? Try to build that into your roadmap. That was something that worked really well for us when I worked on the carbon design system at IBM, was treating our design system like a product, really building out a roadmap and figuring out, okay, for this particular team, they're going to need data tables by the end of Q3. Let's work that into our roadmap. And then looking at that zoomed out, how can you work in time to innovate and build new components, or have a second look at your colors? Something that was successful for us is we had carved out time every sprint for the design systems team to just focus on learning new things. Like Jeremy mentioned, when Figma has a new plugin or a new tool set, trying to really go deep and have that time carved out for the team so that you're not feeling like you're constantly just in this maintenance maintaining mode and catering to the needs of other teams. You also have that time to build out and learn new things for your own team.
Yeah, awesome. What I'm hearing is that having like a team minimum is super helpful when trying to prioritize, but at the end of the day, it's definitely still a balance. And having a roadmap is also really helpful, but also being able to carve out time for your team to maintain, to learn, and to kind of like upskill and uplevel all the stuff that they're doing.
Yeah, just to add one last thing on that, I think there's a useful bit of strategy that you can employ when you can't work on something. I would highly recommend just being really upfront about it. We've tried and tested a few different methods, and I can honestly say the best thing is if they're like, we want this feature, it's quite important for our product. Sorry, we just can't work on it until this date. Give them a date, even honestly, we've given a date that's like 10 months in the future, like a huge long time. And then just after that, sort of end it with, do you want to build it for us? Just a nice little way to try and snag a new contributor. And it has worked exactly 3 times for us that someone's done it. So, it's not 0. And it's been really helpful. So yeah, that's what I recommend doing. Tell them you can't, and then try and make them do it.
That's a great hook to get more folks contributing, especially if they already need it and they were probably build it anyway. There's a question about deprecating. So when do you all decide to deprecate? component, token, pattern, anything within your design system? And then also, how do you communicate that decision to your product and feature teams, especially if they're using it right now?
Just when you've had enough of it, when it's just pissed you off beyond, it's like, all right, done, out of here.
See, I was going to say, I get so emotionally attached to my work that when I'm like, oh, we're going to deprecate this button, but I remember back in the day when we built this button and how much thinking went into it. But yeah, Henry's right. Sometimes it's just time for a refresh. Sometimes components aren't flexible enough. You learn new things from when you initially built them, that it's easier to start from scratch versus like, hey, let's try to manipulate the code in a way that this can scale to the amount of teams that we need. So it's really a blend of like figuring out if what you have can scale and is going to continue to work, or is it easier to just, you know, kind of go back to the drawing board, start from scratch. There were a lot of, I remember, accessibility concerns that came up with the first version that we built for Carbon. And so for a lot of the components, it was like, well, what's the level of effort involved in trying to manipulate this component and, you know, make it AA or AAA compliant versus let's start from scratch. We know much better now. We have a lot more knowledge as a team, and we can do better this time.
Yeah, I think to further the point about like comms and keeping transparency, you know, when we do decide that we need to deprecate a component or a pattern or whatever, it's always that early and often, you know, letting everyone know. Kind of the checklist in my mind is like, here's what's happening. We're deprecating this thing. Maybe like a TLDR why, and then what folks need to do. And usually it's a multi-tiered, multi-phase comms of like, here's what's happening, you know, slated for blah, 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 a couple months or do something. And then during the time it's being deprecated, you may give a deadline. Hey, we need y'all to migrate to this new component, which is brand spanking new, has all these great features. And, you know, I love how Figma, whenever they roll out features, there's a playground. They can manipulate and really get your hands on it. And so at Lyft, we were trying to do something similar, so that like, hey, this is what's actually happening. Here's how it affects you all. And here's how you actually migrate to the new component. You know, we were playing with this idea of like, well, that deprecated component we're going to deprecate, well, let's call it legacy, you know, in the name. And then at a certain date, we're going to say, we're going to deprecate it. It's going away, you know, and we unpublish it. There will be instances where that will still exist. But what's great about Figma tooling is that you can kind of like create a plugin and see like, oh, are they using the wrong thing? Can we migrate it? Can we find a way to like make it easier for them to choose a new thing, whether it's legacy, selection control, and then or segmenting control. That's one we did at Lyft, and then the new one. And so, and then after that, you have another column of like, hey, here's the new thing, we deprecated it, and then we actually kind of write kind of a FAQ or kind of light documentation around that whole thing. So we're capturing context, decisions made, why we're doing those things, and then the steps to kind of like move towards it. And then we call it a day, hopefully. But we will find some instances where it's like that deprecated component may exist in some form. But we're hoping that transparency, that partnership in a way that we're building with our designers and especially engineers, know that, hey, we're doing this and it's not a willy-nilly thing. And that's something that personally I didn't expect to be writing comms as a designer as much as that. But it's actually really, you know, setting that example is really good, because now you have this kind of template for later. And especially you can kind of reframe it too. If you have a contribution, you can do the same thing with celebrating that person who helped out and partnered, and you get that kind of buzz around things. And so comms, you know, again, we're not writers, but you know, making it fun and, you know, early and often is very important. So no one's like blindsided, because you don't know how everyone gets either email, Slack, or whatever. People are on vacation, and so some people are going to be like, "Whoa, what's going on?" So having that multi-tiered hopefully captures everybody, and then you partner with design managers and, you know, engineering partners, to make sure that, hey, this is happening. It's almost like that launch phase, like, hey, this is happening, get some excitement around it. Even though it's like, I've been there too, where like, oh man, that map pin, whew, that was a long time to figure out, and we're changing it, like, which we should, because but you have that nostalgia around it. But what's cool about that is that it shows that the systems team is evolving things, and we want to make it better, because the system can't be stale. And so that's something, the struggle that we have to figure out, that balance between, is this breaking change, is it worth it? Versus, like, it's okay, but it's going to be too much of a hassle for everybody else.
Yeah, just to jump in also with a serious answer, but on the writing comms part, oh my goodness, I must say that writing comms is such a big one. And yeah, actually, I should have mentioned that in my day-to-day, because it's like 20% of my week is writing comms, like writing release notes and things like that. And I cannot express how important it is. Like, people have got to know what you're doing. And I think something to set up early on in your comms channels, like make sure that you can try and, like, we now are just setting up like mailing lists and things like that. And we're just sort of trying to hoard people onto our mailing list to make sure that we can like reach out to them in all channels possible. But yeah, so I just wanted to sort of particularly pick on that one. But when it comes to deprecation, it's something that we're still working out. I know that there's lots of sort of like technical ways and technical implementations. You can get like console messages and things like that. But then when it comes to communicating about it, I think as far in advance as possible is probably the best way. Just like really overly tell people. I think we're quite timid when it comes to deprecation on the whole, like at least in our design system. Because it's like, if someone's still using it, like we have sort of, we keep same versions available. People can pick a version, and I occasionally come by some projects who are using like a version of our design system that's like 3 years old, and I think that's fine though. It's okay. I mean, it's not great, but it's okay. So yeah, we're quite tentative when it comes to deprecating stuff. We're just like, yeah, we can keep doing it. But it's good to hear, because we're about to have a huge amount of deprecations, because we're sort of like changing a few things. So I'm taking notes from you guys.
I do have a question about timing and communication. Is there something that's communicating too far in advance? Like a year, are we talking? Or when you guys say really far in advance, are you thinking like a month, a quarter? Would love to get some more like time frames around these words. What are we really talking about? And then like, do you follow up a week in advance? I'm also like, my job is also mostly communications, as you can see from the emails that I sent you all. But it's like, okay, so for a webinar, you tell people an hour in advance, a day in advance, a week in advance. What's that look like for you all? Is it like a week, a month, a year?
For the instances that I remember, we have two ranges. For a component deprecation, I think we did at least a month, and then a week, and then a week after. When we had a new version of what we were planning for our system, we did it a quarter advance, just to be like, hey, this is happening, and we tied it with all the great Figma features that had, launched, and assessed what we wanted to do to make things more usable for our partners. And so maybe it's depending on the level of effort for our team and the level of migration on everybody else's side. And so it could be like I know here at Disney Streaming, we use a lot of templates. And so components that live in those templates, who make up those templates, they may not see that backend stuff that we do on that element, for example. But things are still shifting. And that type of thing. Any overrides that they apply may get tweaked. And so that's something that we would write into our documentation comms of like, if you see this, this is the reason why we updated this element, blah blah blah. So they're not like, is this a bug? That type of thing. But for us, at Lyft, what we saw was like, a month is kind of a good time if it's very, very low efforts. But anything larger than, we want to make sure that especially design managers and folks who are looking and trying to, if it's going to be a huge impact, that they build that in maybe a migration thing in their roadmap, so they're not blindsided. And so we saw a quarter minimum. 2 quarters might be too far advanced, but it really depends on the org. If the org is smaller, then maybe you don't need that much time. But we want to make sure everyone's in the know before something happens. And sometimes it happens where like, I didn't even know this was happening, even though their name is on that email, the multiple emails and whatnot. So because everyone's busy.
For sure. Cool. So I want to make sure we do have time for audience questions since we've got a lot of great ones in the Q&A. So I have one final question, which personally for me is the most important as a community person. How do we encourage and motivate people, the teams who are maintaining and updating the design systems? It's usually a pretty thankless job to keep like looking at tickets and like keeping things updated. And some people also mention like stifling creativity. So how can we better celebrate and recognize folks who are doing maintenance work, people who are jumping in to keep things afloat and running, fixing those bugs?
Yeah, there's a ton of creative ways to approach this. I think off the heels of our conversation about communication, you kind of have to be your own team, and whatever that looks like, whether you incorporate a badging system. I know IBM does that for their design thinking platform. Like you could, take a certain amount of courses and you get a badge and different leveling. Whether you have a company recognition platform that you utilize, that you can recognize people for their contributions, because typically it is outside of their day-to-day if they aren't a part of the design system team. And so making people feel recognized and feel seen, I think, is a big part of that, because it does take so much work to maintain it. And oftentimes, even having outside contributors helps shape the design system to be something even better than it would be a fresh set of eyes, someone that found a bug that went ahead and fixed it. It's just like, wow, thank you so much. Like, you are making our jobs better and making this design system better. So I do think like recognition in some form is a big part of it. But then I think I heard both Jeremy and Henry mention this, like, is this person interested in working on design systems full time? Do you want to bring them onto the team? A lot of people who have the motivation to contribute are just naturally systems thinkers. So trying to identify those folks and give them an opportunity to be a part of the larger team, I think is really exciting as well.
There's one thing that I know I used as an incentive whenever I work with folks who are thinking about contributing, but haven't made that leap because it obviously takes a lot of time. It's actually career growth. When you think about it, something that you can write in your career progress check-ins and stuff, because we mentioned it earlier that we see the system as our product. We work on it, but all those feature team designers have a certain expertise, and getting them outside of their just focus group adds that kind of like proficiency that you're helping the larger design team or the product in the grand scheme of things. Whether it's a component or an interaction pattern that you create that someone else can use, like that is career growth. That's affecting and impacting outside of your typical sphere, and that's exciting because I'm a firm believer, and I was this way too. I didn't know anything about systems when I started playing in systems. It's the muscle you kind of build, and then that actually makes you a better designer, in my opinion. And that's something personally that I think people can learn. It's certain questions you ask or certain things you look out for, but thinking outside of your general area, makes you think about those things later, whether it's accessibility or another variant that could be useful for somebody else, that type of thing. And that's just good in general. And so I call it systems education, but also that's something that you can add and someone can write in their career growth and see if that can help them with leveling. Because at the end of the day, like, yes, you're building this thing for you and your team, but that's a cherry on top if it affects and help other folks. Smaller teams or other features that could like thinking they may be thinking the same thing and like, oh wait, this is already here, great, and that's engineering time that's cut down and quicker to launch, and that's a win for the business.
Yeah, we try and give credit just about everywhere, really. Starting with non-council members, so people who have contributed themselves, we shout them out in our release notes, and we try and make sure it's a really nice message as well to have a big thank you, in the hope that it will sweeten them up when we try and ask them again in the future for more. So I think that giving people credit is really, really, really important. When it comes to the council, I think that we do try and give each other credit, but I suppose a message to everyone here is that, like, do make sure that you reach out to your maintainers or whoever they are and give them some credit every now and again. Tell each other that you're doing a great job. And in our own council, when someone has done a great job, all of us, give them a big thank you and say well done and say how beautiful their work is. Even if it's not beautiful, maybe you just say it's beautiful anyway. Give them a pickup on that Thursday afternoon. But yeah, and I think I don't know if I'm sort of segueing off here, but something that Jeremy said really interests me, which is learning systems. I think that's something that's really not discussed about at all, and that kind of systems education is such an interesting topic to dive into, and seeing about how, especially when I'm working with like new designers who haven't worked on systems before, it's kind of funny when they say, oh yeah, like I've done the designs, and it's like, oh yeah, but what about the error states? Like, what about the disabled states? What about these states? And they're like, oh God. And then I'm like, oh, but what happens when I break it like this? And sort of all of these like little system-y component things. So I think just to jump on that, yeah, it's so interesting to see how you can evolve those skills. And I love the idea actually of making sure that that's something that they can get recognition for their objectives or whatever. So that's a really nice another piece on there.
I love that. I definitely think there's a lot there in terms of design systems education and also career growth and tying that back into business goals. And one thing somebody said in the chat that wasn't sent to everybody, but when you send those thank you notes, CC their boss, CC their manager, give them that further shout out so that does help their career growth and their boss sees that they're participating on that systems level. But it looks like we have about 10 minutes left and like 9-10 questions. So let's jump right into those. So I'm looking at the ones that got upvoted the most. So if you have questions that are already asked, please upvote them. How would you ensure design system maintenance work doesn't fall behind when you're also responsible for UI design of products? And also, what methods do you use to increase team contribution to the design system? And what does that process look like? So a two-parter.
This is something that's interesting, right? Because obviously everyone's busy and there's a lot of work that some folks have to prioritize. But I'm a firm believer of a roadmap. It may not sound super sexy or anything like that, but like it really helps, especially when you're trying to line up things with like engineering partners. So like, hey, we're going to be doing this component, or we're going to look at this thing together, and that's something that we can use almost as a crutch to be like, hey, so this is maintenance time, this is new stuff time, and we're going to being flexible that like maybe there's a partner that can help us with that new component or whatever, or even help with the auditing, and so we can bring them in and help with like talking to the design managers like, hey, we may need them to consult or whatever. And so having some structure that is flexible really helps kind of balance that, and not falling behind. This is something I pitched at Lyft, that maintenance of a system, especially with the new things that Figma puts out or anything new that we want to incorporate, is almost a yearly thing, because there's so many great things that they come out with, but also we learn some things and things, are kind of legacy in that same mindset of like, for example, auto layout and trying to enhance, like even to the effect of enhancing a component with these features takes a lot of work too. And so I was pitching, a maintenance time that we would do that. But again, that includes all the other things that we talked about earlier about the comms that we have to write and how this impacts other people, and if we want to have user testing with it so that we can make sure that it's actually making sense, trying to enhance how we do things. And so for me, a roadmap or even a loose kind of game plan really helps. And this also goes back to that team that is supporting the system. You can start to allocate folks to just do maintenance versus consulting and doing some new things, or even like if we have enough people resourcing, thinking about contribution and what that may look like as a whole versus just trying to get people to contribute and whatnot. I built I wrote kind of like playbooks at Lyft on the contribution process, so like what a contributor does, what a systems consultant supporter does, what an engineer does, a systems engineer may do, like all that stuff. So that takes a lot of people, but yeah, we don't want to be missing any of those systems, the maintenance things, and not wanting to fall behind. And so what we found was a roadmap might help. That helped us. There may be other ways, but that's something that and again, I say very, very clearly, being flexible that the roadmap will change. Even though we say, hey, we're going to do this, well, things happen with the business and whatever. And so, but at least that helps us kind of like plan for it.
I think I'll add manage your expectations. I think that's really important. So you probably want to focus on your product first, right? Like get the actual product out there. It's okay if your design system lags behind like a little bit. It's very difficult to make sure that you have everything up to date. And you often run into issues where like if your product is requesting a feature that you want to have in the design system directly, and you're like we said, okay, it's going to be like 10 months or something crazy like that, or even if it's going to be like 2 months, if they can wait, then that's great. But manage expectations right up front, and focus on value. I think I'll give Dan Moore a shout out here and his talk, My First Component. I think that mindset really applies. So basically what it is, focus on the most valuable component. So if you're really lagging behind, obviously only create what is going to be really valuable. So, and the way I would go about doing that, if you had an existing product, make a list of every component that's inside the product, see which ones are duplicated the most, see which ones have the highest level of technical effort, and correlate those and focus on the ones that are the top of those lists at the end. So focus on value and really manage your expectations there. That's how I'd go sort of about doing that. And then to increase contribution, make it fun for people. That's going to be my advice there. So we talked a little bit earlier about systems mindsets and how it's kind of hard. If it's too tough and if you're moving too fast for the designer to really learn about how to make nice error states or whatever, just do it for them afterwards, after they give you the component. Try and strip out all of the tough bits. Like if they really hate writing documentation, write the documentation for them as a maintainer. That's what we really try and do. We try and strip everything that might be considered boring out of the process to really enable maintainers to have like a good time and really focus on that high of creating a component and then shout them out, give them all the credit and everything like that. I think that's the way that we go about it anyway.
Bethany, anything you wanted to add?
We are dealing with this exact problem right now for the first question on like maintaining your design system, but also catering to your product team's needs, because the team that I manage, we work across 3 different platforms, web, desktop based, and then also mobile. And we don't have any people on the design system team right now that are actively working on building out those desktop libraries. So what I told this designer is, it's going to help us in the long run. It's going to help our team work more efficiently if we have this source of truth, and then we can contribute that to the larger system. So we try to work out, each quarter, or even look at it on a sprint basis. Can you dedicate 1 to 2 days to just slowly chip away at making progress towards these desktop libraries? And part of it is just starting with like a big audit. So it takes some time to just get through the cruft of figuring out what we want the system to be. But I think if you continually work towards something, it's like with anything in life, you'll make progress, even though it looks a little bit slower than what you think.
Yeah, for sure. I think what I'm hearing in terms of balancing, whether it's stuff within the design system or balancing things between the design system and things the product needs, is one, make a roadmap, which will help you then set expectations and manage expectations. I think to Henry's point, both for yourself and for your other teams, like don't expect everything to be perfect. Your design system won't cover everything. And I think giving yourself and your team that grace to not have it all perfect and ready to go will kind of reduce some of that stress, hopefully, and that anxiety. And then, of course, being flexible with your roadmap. And then I think when it comes to prioritizing, looking at what provides a lot of value. So the shout out to Dan and his talk about the next component. I think folks definitely check that out. And looking at what's being used the most, what's really going to give back to the most to product teams so that you can communicate that value and understanding what's most important to the business. I think all of those things are really what will help folks balance all the competing needs that your team is getting like pulled towards. So that is our talk. Thank you all so much. I do have a couple of things to share before we wrap up, but this will be really quick. Before we get to that though, there are a couple of more questions. As I mentioned at the top of the call, our speakers have kindly agreed to answer some of those. Some of them also got typed out answers. So if you want to check out the answer tab, some folks, our panelists, answer them there. We'll also include that in the blog post so you can read them on Supernova. But super quickly, if you all are interested in participating in some more things related to Supernova, or just want to have more detailed discussions or in-depth discussions about design systems, we are launching a new program called Our Design System is Fine, Community Conversations. So these will be curated small group discussions designed for you all to connect with other design system practitioners who really get it and talk shop and really talk through your challenges in a small group setting. And then second, we are opening the doors for speakers. So if you'd like to speak at one of our future events, whether that's a panel or a fireside chat, please fill out this form. Specifically, I do want to say that I would love to highlight more new diverse voices in the design systems community. So if you've ever wondered if you're qualified to speak or if speaking is right for you, the answer is yes, and you should definitely give it a go. This is your chance. And also if you're in the audience and you know someone on your team or a friend in design systems who you wish would speak more, send this over to them. But thank you all so much for attending. We'll be sharing a recording of the panel via email later this week, and also working with you all to answer the rest of the Q&A questions and also sending out a recap. So thank you all so much for joining us on this fine Wednesday. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all.